Welcome to Antitrust Code by Concurrences. Concurrences is the leading antitrust database, with over 30,000 articles on competition law. Concurrences is also the largest network of antitrust experts, with lawyers, economists, enforcers, and academics in 85 countries. By listening to this podcast, you will learn the fundamentals of competition law and hear about the latest antitrust news, thanks to our guests, the best experts in the antitrust world.
Hello and welcome to today's Concurrence podcast. My name is Aleksander Tombiński. I'm a counsel with the antitrust team with Clifford Chance in Brussels. And I have the pleasure today of discussing with Alberto Bacchiega, director at the DG Comp at the European Commission, in charge of enforcing the EU Digital Markets Act. Hello, Alberto.
Hi, Alex. Pleasure to talk to you.
So we have just finished a panel, the Antitrust Horizon event hosted by Concurrence. And I think it's fair to say that the DMA is quite a hot topic. We had a number of questions and discussions about the topic. And we are now a year into the enforcement, a year since the designation decision, 6 months, the first designation decision, 6 months from the moment when the first compliance obligations kicked in. And it's a great time, therefore, to discuss the DMA. And perhaps to kick us off, I was thinking we could start with some rapid fire questions that call for a yes-no answer or a one-liner answer. How does that sound?
Okay, let's try.
Okay, so the first proposition I have for you is that the DMA has achieved its goal of increasing the speed of enforcement.
We started well. Achievement is yet to come.
Okay. The second proposition is that it has achieved its goal of increasing the competitiveness and contestability of the markets.
Yes, and there is a lot more to do.
Okay. The third proposition I had is that it is the right tool to address perceived challenges of some new emerging technologies, such as generative AI.
Not alone.
Not alone. Okay. The next question I had is that, or proposition, is that the Illumina Grail judgment has rendered meaningless the obligation for gatekeepers to report their transactions under the DMA.
No.
Okay. The penultimate proposition is that it's too early for the Commission to issue guidelines on DMA compliance.
Yes.
And the last proposition is that companies should worry of divergent outcomes between DMA enforcement and the UK Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Act enforcement.
No. Okay.
So after this round of very short rapid fire questions, I'll give you the opportunity to elaborate maybe on some of these points. Let us start with the speed and nature of enforcement under the DMA. You said that there is more to be done in terms of speed from your, that's what I gather from your short answer. And in practice, what we've seen is the Commission issuing a number of RFIs, quite burdensome RFIs, onto gatekeepers. And that is quite understandable, particularly in the first months of enforcement. And I was curious to hear whether this is going to be the lay of the land going forward, these constant RFIs to gatekeepers, or should companies expect sort of achieving cruise control at some point where they will be reporting on their compliance and that will be there won't be that much more burden on them?
But it depends very much what the gatekeepers do. I mean, the RFIs, which is the request for information, is the well-known acronym in the competition world, are simply the way we gather information from companies. We need to do it in writing because the process is in writing. We need to have a file that that we can then provide to companies for their own defense, that we can provide to the court. So the fact that we ask information in writing, it will not change. I understand more your question is that we are asking a lot of information over and above what is in the compliance reports of the gatekeepers themselves. I think this will remain the case because we need to understand the solution they bring, and certainly will remain the case as long as we don't see effective compliance with the provisions and the obligations of the DMA.
And so maybe a follow-up on that. So how do you measure the effectiveness of compliance? Is it, or should it not be by checking the compliance reports and the efforts, or are you also looking at particular outcomes?
We are certainly checking a compliance report. Of course, there is compliance with the letter of the DMA. This is very important. That is the type of check you want to do. But the DMA is not asking compliance only with the letter of the act, but this effective compliance is actually hardwired in the DMA. So effective compliance can only be verified in the markets. How do we check compliance? First, if we are comfortable with the solution that has been provided, but then super important for us is to receive feedback from business users, from users, consumer associations, about whether they can make use of the provisions for their benefit, and if these work. And thirdly, we would like to see some effects on the market. So we would like to see some things that change with respect to the past. Because if nothing changes, in a way, either the obligation was pointless to start with, or maybe the implementation of the obligation was not as good as it should be.
I guess this is the core question, how does one decide whether the obligation perhaps was not necessary in a particular market dynamic versus the compliance is ineffective? And that's perhaps something that enforcers should also bear in mind. As a private practitioner, I'd say this is something enforcers should bear in mind.
I think a few pointers we have that. First, if we have businesses that come and say, I would like to do this, but today I cannot, or I couldn't before the DMA. With the DMA, there is the possibility for me to have access to an opportunity that I didn't have before. And we think that this request is legitimate. Then we measure success in whether did we actually provide access for this business or not. And so this is very important. Of course, we have also to bear in mind that sometimes there might be less demand than what we had predicted for certain feature, for certain things. Honestly, we are not yet there. And what is very important for us is that the solution that is provided by the gatekeeper is not provided in isolation, that is actually tested with the market, that the stakeholder feedback is sought. And when this happens and when the feedback is positive, then we have much more confidence that the solution is good. If we get negative feedback or it's never been tested with the market and then it doesn't work, I think we are rather suspicious.
Okay. So you mentioned several times market feedback and the importance of market feedback. And during our panel earlier, you had walked us through the different investigation decision or the opening of the different investigations. And I guess one of the gatekeeper compliance plan that has received significant attention or criticism from various stakeholders was Apple's. And if I counted correctly, Apple is perhaps the undertaking that has been the target by the greatest number of investigations or proceedings. They are at the most advanced stage with with the preliminary findings in the steering provisions. And you've also opened for the first time these specification decisions. So could you tell us a bit more about what led you to opening these different proceedings against Apple, and what can we expect in terms of next steps?
Against Apple, against Meta, or against Alphabet, the reason is always the same. We had a suspicion that the compliance solution that was put forward by the gatekeepers was non-compliant with the letter of the DMA in many cases, and with what the intent of the DMA certainly. So this is the reason why we opened the investigation. We thought we received a lot of feedback from the market. These are very important things. There are very significant changes on the side of the gatekeepers. So but what is important is that we receive feedback, and those are our own analysis, is that we're not making the mark. This is for the non-compliance investigation. The specification investigation are really different in nature. They, for example, they will not lead to a fine. They don't count, that if a gatekeeper receives 3 non-compliance decisions within a certain period of time, that would trigger possibly harsher measures, possibly structural measures. This also doesn't apply to specification decision. So specification decision is meant to be more of a partnership to clarify how certain provisions should be applied in specific cases.
And I know it's early days, but how is that partnership different from the regulatory dialogue that you've had with the gatekeepers from the beginning?
Regulatory dialogue is basically a solution that comes to us. We have a dialogue, we have feedback, and like this, and then we say, okay, ideally it ends up saying we are happy with your solution, roll it out, or you've already rolled it out, and we are happy with it, and now we see how it works in practice. For the specification, we think that there is the need more to codify the way actually the solution should work. So there is more, if you want, a bit more intervention on the side of the Commission in shaping the solution.
And is there a role for third parties as well in that specification process?
Absolutely, there will be. Actually, specification process is actually shorter than non-compliance. It's 6 months rather than 12. And after 3 months, we have to issue preliminary findings, and we actually have to make public a version of the preliminary findings for comment from third parties.
Okay. So let me perhaps switch gears and move to something different, but that is also attracting a lot of public and regulatory attention, which is AI, and in particular generative AI. And I think you mentioned in our rapid fire questions that the DMA has a role, but it not alone. So I'd be interested in hearing on what that role would be. And also, at least when I look at AI, there isn't really a clear winner there in that space. There's still a lot of investment, a lot of competition. And there is a concern, also reflected in the Draghi report, that too much regulation might have a detrimental impact on innovation. And so as an enforcer, how do you balance those risks?
So indeed, it's not a nascent technology. AI has been around for many, many years. Generative AI, large language model, that's more new, and that is what has brought it to absolutely everyone's attention, and that has made a lot of impact in the last less than 2 years. The pace and the acceleration is quite amazing. What can the DMA do? But AI is a feature. It's a very important technology, generative AI. The DMA is addressing platforms. So to the extent that AI is a feature that is rolled out in the platform that are under the scrutiny of the DMA, of course, we have a full mandate to scrutinize this platform, including AI. Just to make an example, Google Search is a designated platform. If they roll out AI on Google Search, it's certainly part of our analysis. Same for the advertising services we designated, for the marketplaces we designated, for the operating systems we designated. So there is fully within the DMA. There is another aspect of AI that is not necessarily within the DMA. The AI is also a value chain, starting from hardware, data center, resources, brains, very important, data, financial capabilities. All these aspects are not necessarily caught by the DMA. And that's why earlier I said not alone, because it must be all the competition instruments looking at this. Just to make an example, there is a very vibrant environment in the development of models, but we also saw that there is acquisitions taking place from smaller companies with very good ideas. They've been acquired by much larger companies, or they've been invested in by larger companies, or we've seen also examples of very large company basically hiring everyone in an AI startup, absolutely everyone, and maybe taking also a license on the IP. And then, then we have the good question: is it a concentration? Is it a merger control? Or no? So we need to look at globally the phenomenon, without jumping too much into conclusion, because indeed there is the risk of over-regulating and hampering the development of AI in Europe.
Maybe to pick up on the point you mentioned about concentrations or other transactions. So we know that in the DMA itself there is the provision, Article 14, that requires designated gatekeepers on reporting their transactions. And we've also discussed during the panel the Illumina Grail, and I'm interested in your take. You said that Article 14 is not meaningless after Illumina Grail. So I'd be interested in hearing.
So there are, I think, two main goals in Article 14. One is a transparency goal, simply that that gatekeepers have an additional responsibility to communicate, to inform the Commission about transaction, but we make them public. There is a time gap because there might be a confidentiality period when transactions are not yet known or not, but that's as a transparency thing, which is good in itself. Of course, the other goal of the Article 14 is to allow the competent authorities of being informed about transactions that normally don't fall under an obligation of notification. So after the Illumina Grail, the Commission cannot, basically member states cannot refer transactions for which they don't have jurisdiction, but some member states have calling powers. So this transparency feature can still feed in. Maybe to somehow a lesser extent than if the court had upheld our decision in Illumina Grail, but it's still useful, I think.
Because we've seen with Microsoft Inflection the referrals being withdrawn in days after the Illumina Grail case. So it's
that was
chilling effect.
Yeah, that has been a direct consequence of the Illumina Grail thing. But the Commission has also issued a statement affirming that Microsoft Inflection is actually a concentration in our analysis. So that remains, and as it is a concentration, companies have an obligation to inform under Article 14.
Okay, so moving to another topic, another regime that also has a requirement on merger and transparency is the newly enacted UK Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Act. But it has a slightly different approach than the DMA, where the DMA imposes similar obligations across a variety of business models. There are some differences, but generally the same obligations apply across board. The DMCC, so the UK regime, provides for more flexibility both in terms of choosing which firms to designate as those with significant strategic market significance, and also in terms of designing the conduct requirements. And from a practitioner's perspective, flexibility rhymes with uncertainty. And so is this something that companies should fear? Should we expect a cooperation between the Commission and the CMA?
Yeah. But on your last question, absolutely. It's another competition agency. Of course, there has been Brexit, so their role with respect to the European Commission has changed radically. But we have set up very good channels of communication with the colleagues at the CMA and the Digital Markets Unit, which is the one that will enforce the DMCC more directly, and we will continue doing so. Very often we talk about global markets and global solutions. So these are global problems, but it's certainly true that within Europe as a continent, there is a proximity between the European Union and the UK that certainly will be reflected in the cooperation. On your question whether the two different models, more prescriptive for the DMA, let's say, more flexible for the NCC will lead necessarily to divergence. There, I don't believe so. And of course, there might be, we have a closed list of core platform services, and we have criteria for the designation of gatekeepers, but there we also have flexibility. We have qualitative designations as well, so we are not completely bound by this one, and we have the possibility of accepting rebuttals, so we can if you want, we can seed out both the false positive and the false negatives in our system. But what is true, if a platform is not in a core in our list, we cannot address it under the DMA. Maybe the colleagues in the UK will be able. Maybe they will choose not to have, at least in the beginning, the whole breadth of, we have 7 gatekeepers, 24 core platform services now. Maybe they will want to have more, less, that I don't know. I think for me what is important, when we both work on the same case, on the same provision, on the same conduct, then we will coordinate and we will ensure outcomes that at the very least are not contradictory, but at best that they are fully coherent. And there, if I can say it very quickly, for that it's crucial that the companies play ball. If the companies want us to have a coherent outcome, they also have to allow us to talk and to exchange, and and not to, if you want to play one jurisdiction against the other, because that is the fastest route to diverging outcomes.
Yeah. I think from a company's perspective and practitioner's perspective, it's very reassuring to hear that the ideal outcome is where the same solution works, is compliant across board. I think we'd welcome the same statement from the CMA as well now. But to bring this to a close, I'll ask you one last question. Out of all of the provisions of the DMA, and there's quite a few of them, is there any one that you found particularly challenging to apply?
Look, some are certainly require more attention than others. I think without picking of a specific all those for which we have opened non-compliance investigation, obviously we couldn't find a solution through the regulatory dialogue. So these are ones. And also perhaps as a category, of course, it's more difficult to enforce obligations that go at the heart of the business model of the gatekeepers. That we also have to be mindful that there is a lot of history, a lot of passion, a lot of belief in what the gatekeepers do, and sometimes we require them to change quite radically what they do. We think for a good reason, but that of course require much more in-depth discussions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alberto, for your time.
Thank you, Alex.
Great discussion. Thank you.
Pleasure.
You listened to an episode of Antitrust Code by Concurrences. If you want to read more about this topic, check the Concurrences website, where you can find all relevant articles. Follow us on Twitter @CompetitionLaws, and join the Concurrences group on LinkedIn to receive updates on our next podcast.